So for the 13th day of class, we're going into more detail to what we started yesterday, how China influenced a lot of Asia, but these Asian nations eventually take on their own identity. And in this case, we looked at Japan. And we're going to learn a lot about Japan throughout this year. Very interesting story. And although our exam is going to be from 1200 to the present, I want to lay down the foundation to how Japan became Japan. And if we look at the Yamato period, at this point, Japan is heavily influenced by the Chinese in terms of their religion, their language, their art, their architecture. A parallel, if you don't understand this, if I were to look at United States history in the 1600s, more British than any unique American flavor, even though there was, seeds planted, it wasn't flourishing. And as we get into the Heian period, we start seeing this flourishing and this growth, and we start seeing the rise of large landed estates and arts and literature and a very elaborate ritualistic court life. And we start seeing things like the first novel, The Tale of Genji, which really laid the foundation to Japanese culture. Some books take on a life of their own. They're not just books of literature. They have historical significance. And I won't get into that list right now, but The Tale of Genji is certainly one of those books. And they're moving away from Chinese models in religion, arts, and government and developing their own flavor, their own ethos, their own identity. Okay. And we look at Minamoto Yoritomo, and he founded the Kamakura shogunate. And this is where Japan really starts becoming Japan. Okay. Now let's start with how Japan was running themselves on a governmental level. They used feudalism, as did Russia, as did Europe. Feudalism lasted centuries and centuries because it worked. It was very simple. There was this pyramid, and there was this loyalty for labor exchange, and it was quite simplistic, but it worked really well. The downside of feudalism, if you are a peasant, you don't have a lot of room for growth in your life, is not very pleasant as a peasant. Whereas at the top, you had this. And if you look at the European model, they had knights, and the Japanese had samurai. So the Japanese start moving toward feudalism as their model of government. And they developed this code of living, the Code of Bushido. And the Code of Bushido was predicated on 4 ideas: fidelity, politeness, virility, simplicity. Fidelity, loyalty, just pure loyalty, keeping your word. Politeness, you know what politeness is. Virility means you are physically strong and active. And simplicity. And this was the code that became part of Japanese identity. So we looked at their government with feudalism. We looked at the Bushido Code, which became the foundation of their culture. And again, this culture, in terms of this fidelity, if you violated these tenets of Bushido, it was customary to off yourself with seppuku, ritualistic suicide. You died with honor, and you would kneel on the mat, and you would write a poem, and then you would have a friend give you your short sword, and you would kill yourself, because death was preferable to dishonor. That gives you an idea to the Bushido Code. Now, seriously, they took it. Okay, then we look at the Ashikaga age. Now, in the Ashikaga age, a parallel from other places, or even a human life, we go through stages of our lives where we're trying to find ourselves, and we're trying to figure out who we really are. And I liken the Ashikaga stage to that. So Japan is really finding itself, and we have, the shoguns fighting for power, and the laws aren't super clear, and it's less efficient than the Kamakura era. And so this is an age where it's a little bit chaotic, and Japan's trying to find its identity. Your 20s might be like this, if you follow what I'm saying, okay? But at the same time, we see very advanced culture. I mean, Osaka Castle, this architecture is just tremendous. So I don't want you to think it's just raw chaos. It was a mix, okay? They had some gains, but they had some setbacks, okay? Now, to me, this is ground zero to when Japan really became Japan. This is one of these turning point hinge battles at the Battle of Sekigahara. And it ended the Japanese Civil War and began the Tokugawa shogunate. Okay, this is a important turning point in Japanese history, and you could even argue world history, okay? Now, with the Tokugawa shogunate, it was also called the Edo period, so if you see that in your book or you hear people speak of it, it's the same thing. And they implemented many changes, including the standardization of coins and weights and infrastructural improvement. Infrastructural things would be like canals and pipes and bridges and stuff that everybody uses, okay? And when you see a nation improving its infrastructure, that's usually a good sign. Also, they improved their legal codes and made economic gains. So in a sense, they found themselves. This is when they're hitting their peak, okay? Maybe your 30s and 40s when you were at your peak earning and you figured yourself out and you're doing your thing. It was a good time. Peace, prosperity, literacy went up, intellectual growth. It was a good time. And then an American showed up in 1853 and the story changed, okay? This man was named Commodore Matthew Perry, an American. And here's some historical perspective for you. Here's a photograph of Commodore Perry, and this is how the Americans perceived him. The U.S.-Japan fleet, Perry bringing the gospel of God to the heathen. And we see the beautiful sunset and the white caps, and the fish are jumping, and this majestic ship. Here's how the Japanese wrote him. Okay, I'm not saying, he's Brad Pitt here, but, they made him really, really ugly there, and look at the way they portrayed his ship. Looks like Satan's rowboat here, okay, with the plumage and the evil-looking stuff. So you can see how the Americans perceived him and how the Japanese perceived him. Very different. Same guy, different perspective, right? And when Perry arrived, Japan got a raw deal. And they thought to themselves, they're saying, you know what, we can't let this happen again. This is embarrassing. This is pretty detrimental to us. So Japan has a revolution, the Meiji Restoration, and it was a civil war to end the Tokugawa rule, and they became westernized in terms of their government, their politics, their industries, their banking, science, education, their values. They even started cutting their hair and wearing suits and ties because they felt that they needed to keep up with the West so they were never taken advantage of again. It was actually a wise choice. Looking back on history, it was a good decision. Now, it went so deep where it replaced its religious convictions as a nation, where you had this religion of Shinto, which promoted order and allegiance, and it's the national religion of Japan, okay, to signify a deeper change. Okay, so with this Meiji Restoration, Japan set itself as one of the powers of the world and remained powerful until their loss in World War II in 1945. That's a long time to be kicking butt and taking names, but it's based upon this decision they made to break away from the Tokugawa era into a new, more modern, more Western era, the Meiji Restoration. And you can see it in the way they're dressed and the way they're conducting themselves. They look like Civil War soldiers, right? So you can do some visuals to show you the revolution, okay? So, in short, Japan started off very Chinese in a lot of different ways, but in time developed its own identity, as nations do and as human beings do. So I hope that clarified. It's also pages 60 through 63 of your book, and what I hopefully taught you in this video corresponds with that. So, thank you for watching.